Welcome everyone. My name is Aaliyah Wasila and I am here on behalf of the University of Michigan School of Social Work's Office of Continuing Education. Many of you who are attending today would like continuing education for your participation today. So I just am here at the front to let you know what you need to do to make sure you can earn your CE hours. So the first thing I want to let you know is you may see a live transcript that is running at the bottom of your screen, and you do have the option to toggle that off if you click live transcript on your little menu at the bottom of your screen. So depending on your preferences and needs, please select whichever version of the transcript is most helpful to you. We understand that it's not perfect, but it does often help people who've got background noise or other needs to understand what's going on during the session. So in order to receive CE for attending today, we do need you to stay for the duration of the session. That's the first step. And because today is approved as a live interactive session, we are expecting you to do a little bit of interacting. So that will be happening today via our poll function in Zoom. So you will be prompted to complete various polls throughout the day. And we will come on and prompt you when that happens. You will hear people talking about it, and you should see the poll pop up on your screen. If for some reason you do not see the poll pop up on your screen, please feel free to respond in the chat instead. We do appreciate your participation with these polls today. It's part of how we track attendance and make sure that we're offering a session that is considered live and interactive. So if there's any questions about that, I'm going to be available throughout the session today in the chat. If you have questions about CE in general, I will be reiterating some of this in the chat for you also. And I would also like to direct your attention to a few other features of Zoom before we get started so you know how you can communicate with us today. So we do have a chat box, which we encourage you to use if you have questions technology related or for the presenter, or if you have resources that you'd like to share that you think might be useful for everyone. And we do have a question and answer box as well that we encourage you to use if you have a question for any of our speakers, so that we're able to keep track of those questions and make sure we come back to them toward the end of the session. So I think that is it. I want to pass the mic over to Dean Fedele to do a formal welcome. And again, I will be reiterating this information in the chat for you. So if you have questions about it, make sure you scroll until you see what I've said about CE. So, all right, without further ado, Dean Fedele.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lynn Fedele, Dean of the University of Michigan School of Social Work. It's my honor to welcome you to part one of the 2020 Fedele F. Fauri and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Lecture. This special event is presented annually in recognition of our illustrious former University of Michigan Vice President and the very first Dean of our school, Fedele F. Fauri. And of course, his wife, Iris, is also honored in celebrating Dean Fauri's leadership in the field of child welfare. Due to the pandemic, we're offering this year's conference in a different format with two separate panels. Today, we're delighted to present the first panel. I'm going to say a little bit more about Dean Fauri and his work and impact not only on our school, but on the entire field of child welfare. Much of today's social welfare legislation at both the state and federal levels is a product of Dean Fauri's activities over his 50-year career. First as director of the Michigan Department of Social Services, and then during his years in Washington, D.C., where he held numerous leadership positions. Dean Fauri's accomplishments in child welfare and social work education brought national and international acclaim to the dean himself, to our School of Social Work, and to the University of Michigan. This annual event is made possible by a generous gift from the Fauri family, from alumni and friends, and is intended to serve as a forum for discussing ideas and proposals to enhance the well-being of young people. Today's panel presentation features experts in the child welfare field and will focus on how the COVID-19 pandemic has brought increased focus on enduring challenges and emerging concerns within the child welfare system. And of course, with implications for policy and practice. Todd Herrenkohl, the Mary and Elizabeth Blue Professor of Children and Families, and Shauna Lee, Associate Professor from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, will moderate today's panel discussion. I will now turn the program over to Todd.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Emma, if we could have the first slide. I'd like to introduce, thank you. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel today. And let me first say it's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you all for attending virtually. We have a really wonderful group today to present, as Lynn said, on issues around the pandemic and the way it's shaping and reshaping our thinking about child welfare and child well-being. Christina Rodriguez, Professor of Psychology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, is with us here today, along with Michelle Johnson-Motoyama from the Ohio State University. Lisa Merkel-Holging is our third panelist. She's an associate professor of pediatrics at and the director of the National Center on Family and Group Decision Making at the Kemp Center at the University of Colorado. So before I turn the microphone over to Christina, I'd like to just share a little bit of background with you all to sort of situate the ideas that they'll be talking about. So the current pandemic really has heightened concerns about the well-being of children. There are real concerns about risks from social isolation, rising unemployment, domestic violence, food insecurity, and other risk factors. We also have seen in child protection systems actually a decline in reports of abuse and neglect, or suspected abuse and neglect, which on the surface may sound like a good thing, but to child welfare experts, it's actually a concern that reports are actually simply just not being made. At the same time, we see limited options for safely housing children who are already in care. And clearly the burden of the pandemic is felt more strongly by families already impacted by other forms of risk, such as poverty, racism, and discrimination. Next slide, please. So adding to these challenges or enduring issues that are associated with the child protection, child welfare system, there are long-running concerns about the disproportionate impacts of environmental risks or social determinants that lead to a higher rate of child maltreatment among some populations and child welfare involvement for some as well. There are also limited service options and supports for vulnerable families, and we see that clearly in our state systems where families in need of lower level supports and ongoing services are simply, their needs are simply not being met in some cases. At the same time, we have an overrepresentation of children of color in care and concerns about sort of the deterioration of the child welfare workforce. So these are some real issues, and our panelists today will touch on these issues, if not others, that are ongoing concerns and things that are emerging in real time as we face the current crisis. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Christina Rodriguez. And again, thank you for attending today. Actually, before we do that, we're going to do a poll. If you would, please indicate who is in attendance, whether you're a practitioner, researcher, student, or another attendee. And also respond to the second question, which of the most which is the most of interest today in the panel. Child welfare research, practice, policy, or all of the above.
All right, again, I do want to remind everyone that we are documenting your poll participation for CE attendance today. And if for some reason the polls are not working for you, please feel free to respond in the chat instead. Thank you. It looks like we have most of our responses coming in. I'm going to give a moment for everyone to figure out the polls. This is our first one. We'll be a little speedier probably for the next few that we have. And thank you to those who are responding in the chat. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we can move forward today. And here are our results.
Great, thanks, Aaliyah. Okay, Christina.
Okay, so I am going to thanks so much everybody for coming. I'm going to share my screen so that I can keep track of how that's flowing for everybody. So hopefully that shows up fine. Okay, so I'm going to be really focusing, and if people need to speak to tell me something is wrong, they're probably going to need to speak. I'm aware that my Zoom monitoring system has now just disappeared since I'm now launching this, just as an FYI. So in any event, I'm going to be really focusing on whether or not we can actually document that there has been an actual abuse risk rise in the pandemic by looking at some empirical data. So just to give you a quick overview of the presentation, I'm going to be sort of hitting on, in fact, some of what Todd was just talking about why we might expect there to be an increase in child abuse risk because of the pandemic. Tell you a little bit about the longitudinal study and the findings that we demonstrate from that particular work, and then also what we might then conclude as a consequence of that research. So some specific pandemic stressors are ones that Todd just alluded to. Obviously, we have an economic, generally speaking, economic crises and natural disasters will spark increases in family violence. But this pandemic is unique. So even if we look at previous economic upheavals, even if we look at previous natural disasters, there's sort of an unprecedented confluence for the pandemic. So the pandemic is unique in a number of ways. First, families are spending sort of unprecedented amounts of time together. They're spending more contact time with each other. They're under increased financial strain. Just in terms of employment disruption alone, 40 million people filed for unemployment within the first few months of the pandemic. This was an unprecedented level, not seen since the Depression. So massive amounts of unemployment. That, of course, then sparks concerns about food insecurity, particularly because they were losing access to the school meals program, and that there's going to be a lot more isolation on the part of both children and those parents not having the extra familial supports that they might benefit from normally. Those things were now suddenly out of reach. There's also going to be less out-of-home child contact for surveillance. So precisely what Todd was kind of mentioning, one of the things we can now detect is that there's been approximately a 71% drop in reports to Child Protective Services as a consequence of the pandemic. And a lot of it is because people who normally interact with children and might normally be able to surveil, folks like people in the school system, but also mental health professionals, Child Protective Services workers, medical professionals, suddenly were not seeing children. Now, as a consequence, that meant that suddenly there was potential hidden abuse that was happening. So we were particularly interested in looking at whether or not we can identify that empirically. So some specific questions we were curious about was whether or not parents who feel like they're parenting during the pandemic if it's getting worse, does that literally actually relate to their abuse risk? Like, is it just their perception, or are we able to demonstrate that it was related to standard measures of abuse risk? Also interested in whether or not the actual loss of school meals was actually related to their sense that they were more food insecure. Like, was this just something that, like, we believe this, or can we actually document that? Also, whether or not losing that financial income from either an employment loss or an employment change in terms of reduction of hours is that related to increases in adverse parenting? And are parents who are reporting that they're lonely, are they more likely to perceive that they're having worse pandemic-related parenting? And then did child abuse risk and actual physical and psychological aggression actually increase across? So one of the things that is the advantage is that we're using the following First Families study. And that is a longitudinal study. It's a prospective longitudinal study. The FFF study has been tracking families since before children were born, and the children at this during the COVID pandemic phase were old enough that we can now be able to track what the parents' abuse risk was pre-pandemic. So just to give you a quick overview of the type of sample this is, these are all first-time mothers who were recruited in the last trimester of their pregnancy, and we actually also did recruit their partners as well. Half of that sample is targeted to be at risk. So approximately 52.3% of the sample are under 150% of the poverty line, are receiving federal public assistance, under high school education, unemployed, single parenthood. So half of them were targeted to be at-risk families. So the folks that were particularly interested here for the COVID analysis were the mothers who participated in our Time 4 wave. This is when children would have been about 4 to 4.5 years old. At that point, we had 119 mothers. And then we also had folks during the basically 6-week window of the very start of the pandemic. So we tracked down 106 moms in the FFF study. Children at that age would have been about 5 to 6.5 years old. And what we were measuring in terms of their risk was we had 2 child abuse risk measures, one, that was fairly standard, and then a second measure that actually also asks, that we just asked at the pandemic wave, and it specifically asks about their experience of loneliness so that we could sort of drill down on that mental health component. We were also interested in their reports of whether or not they were engaging in more physical assault towards their children, as well as whether or not they were engaging in more psychological aggression. And then we asked a number of basically pandemic-focused questions, whether or not they felt that compared to their usual parenting, were they hitting more than usual? So this was sort of a more than usual kind of approach. Were they spanking or hitting their children more? Were they engaging in more yelling or screaming at their children? Were they using more harsh words, engaging in more conflict in general? Then in terms of neglect, we were interested in whether or not they felt like they needed to leave their children at home more alone, in part because a lot of these families were essential workers. And so even though there were stay-at-home orders, they were needing to leave home. Whether or not they felt like they were not able to get food for their children, so concerns about feeding, and then not able to show the love and support that they normally show their child, if they felt like that had decreased as well during the pandemic. And we combined these last 3 into a sort of a combined neglect score. Each of these was rated on a 1 to 5 scale. So to tell you a little bit about some of the other additional sort of background things we wanted to know, we wanted to understand what the financial impact was. And so we wanted to see if they had experienced a loss of job or a loss of the hours that they normally would have access to. And then again, if they had had prior access to school meals. So what the first question that I want to pose to you is a poll. So that poll is, have you personally found parenting more challenging during the pandemic? So I'll track to see how those responses come in. I can see the poll at least, that's good.
These responses are coming in much quicker than the previous one. I figured this out. I'll give it one more moment for people to respond. Again, if you're just joining us, you may respond in the chat if the polls are not working for you. All right, I'm going to end our poll.
Okay. And almost half of you said yes, about 16% of you said no, and then there's about a third of you that are not parents. So, okay. So let's see how that compares to what we found. So 33% of our mothers were reporting that they were engaging in more yelling. You can see 35% were reporting more conflict with their children. Again, this is a fairly early stages of the pandemic. This was 6 weeks in April and May. And about 12% were reporting that they were speaking more harshly with their children. Not as many reporting, at least self-reporting, that they were hitting their children more. But we were having some folks reporting that they were needing to leave their child alone, more home alone, and had more difficulty feeding and showing less love towards their children. So in terms of how we then connect this to the things that we were interested in, I'm going to break this down. Mothers who reported more hitting were also more likely to report more abuse risk and to report that they were engaging in more physical assault. So at least from their perception, it does seem to be related to our measures of abuse risk and does seem to be related to their current report of physical assault. Mothers who reported more yelling also seem to be reporting more psychological aggression towards their children, and they were also more likely to demonstrate greater child abuse risk. And then mothers who reported more neglect were also reporting more abuse risk and more psychological aggression. In terms of the financial loss, about 38.6% actually reported that their household had experienced some financial loss as a result of the pandemic. And these moms were more likely to have high abuse risk, and they were also even more likely to report physical assault. They were the ones that were the more likely to say that they were engaging in more physical aggression. And in terms of school meals, as one would expect, if you had prior experience and access to the school meal program, they were reporting more difficulty feeding their children. They were also reporting that they were engaging in more conflict with their child and had more abuse risk. And they were even engaging in more hitting, probably as a consequence of some of their frustrations. And then in terms of loneliness, mothers who were reporting that they were experiencing higher levels of loneliness were also more likely to report that they were engaging in a lot more spanking, a lot more yelling, more conflict, and were engaging in a lot more neglect. So loneliness was also an issue. One of the things that I thought was particularly noticeable was that the increase in loneliness was not associated with abuse risk or with their reports of their actual aggressive behavior towards their child. In other words, their loneliness, their reports of loneliness was actually associated with their perception of being having a harder time parenting. So those of you who were kind of reporting that you personally had found parenting more complicated, this should hopefully connect with you that your own personal experience of sort of the financial or the structural challenges and the potential loneliness seems to be reflected in your perception of those changes. One of the things that was particularly valuable by looking at this longitudinal study was comparing their scores, both basically pre-pandemic and then controlling even for their prior levels of income. So we didn't want it to be that it was because there had been just a high level income phenomenon here. And so actually what we were able to demonstrate is that their mother's abuse risk did change and increase from what their levels were pre-pandemic, and that their psychological aggression increased from their levels pre-pandemic. Mother's physical aggression did not increase. So mothers who are perceiving themselves as increasing in conflict and in yelling, they perceive that they are engaging in more physical and verbal conflict and neglect, and those things are associated with their greater child abuse risk. It was also associated that with the actual increases in child abuse risk and actual increases in psychological aggression, notably not physical aggression. It is possible that since these are families who are tracked by our lab, that they were less willing to report that they were engaging in physical aggression, and yet were fine with reporting that they were engaging in more psychological aggression. And then financial loss was associated with increased abuse risk, and those who had had prior access to school meals were reporting more difficulty feeding their children. And again, loneliness was associated with their sense that they were struggling as parents. So some takeaway messages then is that this really suggests that food insecurity, as Todd was alluding to at the beginning, is clearly important, and that financial uncertainty is likely to be undermining their parenting, as that is related to their abuse risk. It also suggests that parents' loneliness is at least affecting how they see themselves as parent and feel like they're not parenting the way that they would want. And mothers appear to be more willing again to report that they're increasing their psychological aggression. So some takeaway implications here is that, you know, what we need to be thinking, and what I'm hoping we'll get to do in the more discussion part, is the social safety net that a lot of people who are already on the border of being able to manage were really hard hit. And so since this is a relatively high risk sample, we're talking about people who were on the fringe already of being able to manage, and this was particularly challenging for them. One of the things that we're aware of is that we were really heavily reliant as a welfare system to have sentinels out in the field report on child abuse. And suddenly in the midst of this crisis, our sentinels disappeared. We suddenly didn't have access to the people who can tell us something's going on with these children. It was now all kind of being hidden in the home. So that's something that I think represents a real challenge in the way that the system is currently structured. We also have a very reactive child protection system. Todd Harakal's great book on how we maybe need to rethink things in a more proactive, less reactive way is something that we really need to probably start thinking more actively about. And we're going to need to be more creative in times of crisis. How can we actually reach and track families when we're under these kind of conditions? You know, these are really complicated conditions. And then obviously we're going to discuss more implications here during this lecture. So I just want to sort of thank you by ending you with one last poll. Obviously this particular study focused on moms and their perceptions of their own parenting. But if we can launch the second poll, this is more about some food for thought of what is the role of children? How is it that we see has children's behavior gotten better or worse? Has it stayed about the same? You know, some of you might not have children again, but for some folks, one of the things that they feel like their parenting has become challenging is because their children have become more challenging. So what's sort of the role of children in this picture? Because children have to adjust their routines as well. So I was also curious to see what your thoughts was on basically how your kids have been handling the pandemic.
All right, we're going to give a few more moments for folks to respond. Again, to reiterate, the chat is also available to you if you're having problems with the polls. Maybe some folks are thinking about this one.
Are your kids better, worse, or about the same?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll so we are able to keep moving along.
Okay. So not a lot of people saying better. A lot of people saying that their kids are holding their own and they're about the same. And then obviously there's some people who are saying that their kids are doing a little bit worse. It is interesting, by the way, we do have a little bit of that information as well in the FFF study, but I try to focus just on the parenting component here. So in any event, again, like, what about the kids? How many of you are thinking about how the role of children right now during the pandemic? They've obviously been impacted directly as well. So we're gonna have to be a little bit more mindful of how changes in children's routines are posing a challenge for parents. So just want to end with acknowledging my funders, NICHD, and obviously all of my participating OBGYN clinics. So thank you so much, and I will obviously take questions during our little question and answer period. I'm going to try to gracefully stop my share here and switch over.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Christina. And again, we'll have time at the end for question and answers. So please feel free to enter your questions into the chat or hold them until the end. But we'll now, in the interest of time, transition over to Michelle Johnson-Moriyama. Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss some theory and research on the relationship of natural disasters and economic recessions to child maltreatment. What, as a field, we've been learning about trends in violence and child maltreatment in the context of COVID-19. What we're learning in my research program about the effects of the Great Recession on child maltreatment, and also I'll discuss some related research regarding the critical role of the social safety net in terms of child maltreatment prevention. Next slide, please. So to kind of build on a little bit of that context that Todd provided as part of our introduction to today, we know that approximately 4.3 million reports were investigated or received some kind of alternative or differential response nationally in 2018. And of those reports, approximately 678,000 children were confirmed as victims. However, according to news reports, state child abuse and neglect hotlines, reports have declined dramatically, as Christina has indicated. And from various reports and jurisdictions, we see that that decline might range from 11% to 70%, even upwards of 70%. And as she's already discussed, we understand that that decline can largely be attributed to changes in mandated reporting as a function of changes in the kind of contact that children are having with mandated reporters, particularly educators. Yet we also know anecdotally from various news stories, different sources of information, that child abuse hospitalizations, intimate partner violence, and calls to sexual abuse hotlines have been on the rise. So past research is useful for us in terms of understanding gaining some different kinds of insights about why we might be seeing these kinds of trends. I'm going to share a couple of theoretical models with you and then talk about some research that we've been doing in my own program and has been conducted elsewhere regarding the safety net. Next slide. So this is a model developed by Dr. Mosen Rizayan, who has been interested in the relationship between natural disasters and different forms of violence. And you can see here that the major mechanism sort of connecting these phenomena is that of mental distress, whether that's post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, or other forms of mental health concern. And that it's through personal threats to life, which we're experiencing firsthand with COVID-19, loss of loved ones, property loss for some, interruption and failure of social systems and services, the collapse of social cohesion and harmony. In the case of natural disasters, which have been occurring somewhat simultaneously with COVID-19, we've seen massive destruction. We've also seen population displacement. So there are factors that can exacerbate, as if these conditions weren't enough. There are factors that can exacerbate mental distress in the form of scarcity of basic provisions, which we're seeing with food insecurity, difficulty with paying rent, and taking care of basic needs, failures in some cases of law enforcement, powerlessness, aggravations that are caused by a fraudulent bureaucracy, in some cases inept bureaucracies, incompetent bureaucracies, as well as government promises to help victims that are forgotten or that are delayed. All of these things can exacerbate mental health concerns. resulting in anger and stress that can be expressed both inwardly in the form of self-directed violence, substance use, other forms of self-destructive behavior, as well as interpersonal violence. And we know that there are a number of risks that place people at heightened risk for interpersonal violence, including being female, being a child, being elderly, being of low income, having a prior exposure to trauma or to traumatic events, prior exposure to natural disasters, and not receiving adequate or sufficient social support. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, could you go back again? With regard to child maltreatment, there have actually been very few studies that have been conducted that have examined the relationship between natural disasters and child maltreatment. But from the studies that have been conducted, what we do know is that we've seen elevated child abuse rates in the 6 months following Hurricane Hugo and the Loma Prieta earthquake, as well as elevated risk of inflicted and non-inflicted child traumatic brain injury following Hurricane Floyd. So while this research is limited and there's more research that's needed, we do see these significant relationships. So I will also mention that for certain kinds of disasters, we don't see these types of relationships. And so more research is also needed to understand what might be protective in these other circumstances. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So for over 4 decades now, we've seen studies that have demonstrated a significant relationship between economic stress and economic hardship and child maltreatment. The relationship of an economic stressor like the COVID-19 pandemic and economic recession can be understood through the lens of the family process model, or a family process model such as this one, which we've adapted from Rand Conger and his colleagues' work. Here, economic stress may elevate risk for maltreatment through a variety of pathways that are similar to those in the natural disaster model, but may also be somewhat unique. So economic stress, we know, impacts the family's ability to care for a child's basic needs for food, for clothing, and for medical care. Economic stress also strains romantic relationships and can contribute to divorce in single-parent households. We know economic stress also contributes to caregiver depression, problems in parenting, as well as problems with parent-child relationships, and also contributes to, when basic needs go unmet, we can see an uptick in child behavior problems as a result when children aren't properly nourished, when they don't have proper caregiving arrangements. Child behavior problems can emerge, which places children at greater risk of child maltreatment. Okay, next slide, please. So in our own work, we've been examining child maltreatment during the Great Recession as a way of understanding how recessionary conditions can impact child maltreatment, and also thinking forward to how this recession associated with this particular pandemic, what we might expect moving forward. So the chart that you're looking at right now demonstrates substantiated child maltreatment rates from 1990 to 2016. So based on prior research, we might expect to have seen some sort of change in maltreatment rates as a function of the Great Recession. The vertical blue line that you see is when the Great Recession started. So approximately December of 2006, that's sort of the official starting point of the Great Recession. And what's kind of interesting about this particular data is we actually see declines in maltreatment rates over time after the beginning of the recession. So this seemed pretty counterintuitive. And what we decided to do was to dig deeper and to look at state level data. Next slide, please. And what we find when we look at state level data, and here we're looking at the percent change in the number of child abuse and neglect investigations over a slightly different window of time. We're looking at 2005, the year before the recession started, to 2016. We see significant variation, including decreases in maltreatment in some states and pretty drastic increases in maltreatment in others. So this leads to our first poll question. Next slide, please. The question is, why do you think child maltreatment rates varied over this time period? There are a couple of different options here. I will tell you there's not just one correct answer. And in some of our prior discussions, we talked about the fact that you can't choose more than one. But I suggest you choose the one that you think makes the most sense to you. Could it be changes in child maltreatment definitions? Could it be the opioid epidemic? Was it changes in state safety net policies? For example, temporary assistance to needy families, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the Earned Income Tax Credit? Or was it due to the expansion of differential or alternative response programs? Could that have been the reason? So I look forward to seeing what you think about this.
Great, thanks everyone for your poll participation so far. I'm going to leave this open a little bit longer for you to take a stab at answering this question. Again, the chat is a perfectly acceptable place to put your response also. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our poll.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So this is very interesting. It looks like the majority, well, not the majority, but 43% of you suggested that it was because of changes in social safety net policies. And I'll tell you that in our models, so we're using fairly rigorous difference in difference designs to look at the impacts of policy changes over time on our child maltreatment outcomes. We looked at investigations, we've looked at substantiated reports, and also at foster care entries. And what we've learned is that these safety net programs are very important. In fact, somewhat critical to these changes in maltreatment over time. And so what we find, generally speaking, is that states who have had more generous policies in terms of access and in terms of benefits actually had, these policies actually had preventive effects. Restrictions, on the other hand, policies that were less generous, not so much. We actually saw the reverse effects, where we saw increases in investigations, increases in victims, and also increases in foster care entry. We accounted for a number of different factors in our models. And so we know that there's a lot of variation in terms of child welfare systems. So we wanted to account for that in some way. So we included the changes in child maltreatment definitions, as well as the expansion of differential response programs in our models. And interestingly, what we found was that definitions mattered very little. In fact, they didn't matter at all. We didn't see any effects of the definitions. However, we saw strong, consistent, robust effects of differential response programs across all of our models, suggesting that differential response is really an important secondary prevention component in terms of child welfare services provision, but also in thinking about prevention. The opioid epidemic was something we also adjusted for in our models. We wanted to make sure we accounted for that. And while we didn't see any effects of the opioid epidemic, that of course doesn't mean to say that it's not important in some jurisdictions. We know that the opioid epidemic has hit some states, but not others. In states, there's variation in terms of where in a particular geographic area the opioid epidemic may have had its biggest impact. So I would say this is an area that probably deserve some additional research, but we didn't find it to be significant in our national study. Next slide, please. So we're running a little short on time. Let me just say that our findings are really consistent with past research that has found increases in child maltreatment with decreases in state generosity, as well as access to benefits. Next slide, please. And the research is also consistent with policies that have demonstrated decreases in child maltreatment through increased access and increased generosity across a range of programs: earned income tax credit, paid family leave, Medicaid, Medicaid expansion, as well as increases in the minimum wage. And the takeaway point here is that even very small amounts of money appear to matter for prevention. Next slide. So what are the policy implications for child maltreatment prevention during COVID-19? First, federal policies that stabilize income are really critical. So to date, we've had 4 coronavirus legislative measures that have been taken to enhance unemployment insurance, to increase Medicaid funding at the federal level, to increase food security spending. The CDC also has passed an eviction moratorium to protect 43 million renters nationwide through 2020. There have been a number of initiatives at the state and local levels where there's been some creative use of TANF funding, which has not been increased. TANF guidelines have not been changed in any significant way. However, localities are finding ways to use TANF funding to create emergency rental assistance and emergency assistance for other needs. However, clearly, there's a lot of unmet need. And these measures to date really haven't been sufficient. There's a lot of questions that still remain about the trajectory of the disease and how long this recessionary period is going to go on. So it's not surprising that 9 out of 10 Americans right now feel that another coronavirus spending package is needed and necessary. And I will also add that kind of on a final note, that we know that the impacts of this pandemic and of this recession are disproportionately impacting Blacks, Latinx populations, Indigenous populations, as well as immigrant children and families. And these are the same groups, with the exception of immigrant families, who are more likely to come to the attention of child welfare services. These disproportionate impacts, they reflect longstanding inequities that have been institutionalized in education, in housing, in healthcare, also in employment. And it's really this crisis that's crystallizing these disproportionalities and these disparities. And it's the opportunity, and as social workers, it's giving us the imperative to take action and to see these things to begin to change and to come up with creative solutions moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Okay, so we're going to turn very quickly now to our last presenter for the day, Lisa Merkel-Holguin. And then again, we'll have questions at the end. Feel free to continue to post your questions in the chat.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to present to such an illustrious group. I'm going to talk about some of the impacts of COVID-19 on child welfare and really focus in on both transformational efforts and practice changes that we're seeing as a result of this. I'm going to focus in on 4 areas: the workforce, child welfare practice, what we're hearing from people with lived expertise, and some of the competing narratives that are kind of being shared given COVID. So with regard to the workforce, I want to focus in on two areas. I'm part of the Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development in Washington, which is a national cooperative agreement that the Children's Bureau gave to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And I have some direct responsibility for a project in Washington State where we have actually been looking at the effects of telework on the workforce. We started our telework project before COVID, and so it certainly has impacted our research, but we have pivoted pretty quickly, and I have some findings that I'd like to share on that. And then also some of the work that's come out of the ARCH study here in Colorado. So this is just a conceptual framework when we think about telework, right? And it was written by Bohl in 2013 and presented at a conference in Chicago. And pre-COVID, I think it's really important to just make mention that there was really minimal to no formal telework programs or policies in child welfare agencies. Yet at the same time, we know that we've had a workforce crisis with very significant turnover. And we have a call for, especially coming from probably a younger workforce, calling and actually expecting that we would have telework and a more flexible workplace as part of kind of one of the benefits. And so you can see some of the organizational and individual advantages and challenges that they highlighted from their meta-analysis. And much of this has borne out in the research that we're doing in Washington State. We've been interviewing social workers across the state. And the things that they're saying to us are that teleworking has decreased their kind of post-traumatic stress. It has just the improvements in like the physical plant, how that really helps them not only focus more, but they also describe how more efficient they are and how much more productive they are as frontline workers. And they also talk about just the decrease in secondary trauma that they're experiencing from teleworking. The majority of staff in Washington State are teleworking probably 80 to 90% of the time. And so that's kind of an interesting, and going into the office minimally for public health reasons, obviously. But I think what's really curious is the position that that the child welfare field had about telework, and thinking about telework and child welfare's kind of push in the last, I would say, decade and a half to really professionalize the workforce. A colleague in New Zealand, Ian Heislop, who's a social work professor, kind of noted that in thinking about social workers and their reference for the struggle for change in systems, that social workers used to be resistant before their voices were muzzled and domesticated by state bureaucracies. And professionalism is often a code for depoliticalization. And I think that's just a really interesting kind of quote for us to kind of take in and think about as we think about the workforce. Next slide, please. So with teleworking, right, comes the need to manage and supervise differently. And so we did a webinar of over 2,000 supervisors from around the country and said, what are your best ideas around how do you supervise a workforce that is now predominantly teleworking? They talked about just a lot of parallel process pieces, right? Caring for the workforce, really addressing people's resiliency, leading with empathy, making sure that people remain connected to one another within their family system, et cetera. Creating balance, like making sure that there is sufficient flexibility. We're all trying to manage what is kind of an unprecedented time, both in our professional lives as well as in our family lives. People having to, homeschool their children, et cetera. And so just with creating that flexibility, also encouraging routine building, finding rhythm, encouraging people to create a work schedule, kind of stick to it, find ways to create blocks of time in your schedule, right? So there's this concept called deep work and shallow work. And deep work is for those higher cognitive functioning kind of components, and shallow work is for responding to emails. So always trying to carve out time to do that deep work is another strategy that's been suggested. Just discovering what's working for your team. The workers we've talked to around the country and through this webinar talk about how they actually feel like they're getting more quality supervision, that they've created team norms about how they're going to connect with one another, how they're going to support one another, how they're going to ask questions of one another when they have sticky situations. And then around managing deliverables. This was the biggest issue when we were even launching telework before COVID in Washington State. There was just a distrust of the workforce that they would not do the work if they were at home. They would go to the movies instead of like going out and meeting a family. And so that parallel process of how we manage deliverables, we use appreciative inquiry and we use solution-focused questions. And then lastly, just figuring out how to leverage technology, which is not always social workers' strong suit, but what we've seen is that when you provide people with technology, they're really able to manage the work pretty well. So I want to talk about child welfare practice and some of the adaptations that we're seeing that I think are actually really exciting and innovative. So first is family meetings. I've spent 25 years of my career trying to promote and support and study and create policy around the structure of family meetings. And there's so many different types of family meetings. That's a whole nother lecture. But what we can tell from what people have told us, both in webinars as well as some of these interviews that we've been doing, is that there is an increased attendance of family members participating in family meetings, which is a really good thing, right? It's about families creating solutions for themselves, hearing information, digesting it, and creating some plans. And why do we think that is? I think we think it's because the virtual space is changing the power dynamics and decreasing some of the intimidation that oftentimes happens in bureaucratic office spaces. And we're just seeing more family supports because some barriers have been removed. People don't have to take off as much time off of work. Transportation barriers are decreased, and then childcare is no longer an issue. So this kind of parallels for me some of the research from some of the mental health and telehealth studies that show that this virtual access creates some type of comfort for people who are participating. So I think that's like a really interesting innovation that's happened. What are some other modifications? Well, we've seen more virtual support groups for kinship caregivers. We've seen more virtual visits happening, virtual court experiences. We've seen a different belief and recognition that it's important for bio families and foster families to connect more regularly. Around story time every night before a child goes to bed, as an example, was an example that Arapahoe County provided at our conference last week. And I think it's important just to point everybody to the Children's Bureau information memorandum that came out, I want to say it was in the spring. You know, time is like kind of bizarre right now with COVID. But they encouraged us to reframe what we call foster parents and how we think of that relationship between foster parents and birth parents. And what they said is they renamed foster parents as resource parents because they should be a resource and a support to the parents and to the children. So what can we learn? I think what we've learned is that this crisis really can be leveraged for innovation. We're a very resilient field. I think we do, as the other speakers have noted, we need to pay attention to social isolation and the lack of human connection. We know that kinship supports need to be, or kinship caregivers need to continue to be supported, and that virtual practice may be actually an equalizer in some ways and a power disruptor, which I think is kind of is an interesting perspective, especially coming from the parents and the families and the children who we serve. So let's just talk about like, what do people with lived expertise say, right? What are their perspectives of this pandemic? And there's growing bits of research that are out there. We had a conference last week and one of the young care leavers from England said, you know, life is just really suckish right now. And I thought, well, that is completely the truth. And she talked about like their needs for technology, their needs for Wi-Fi access, for stable housing. And one of the other care leavers talked about just the need for increased mental health, you know, their difficulties with managing their mental health. What do parents say? Well, some of the research is showing how, you know, concerned parents are. Like, do these delays, how does it impact their ASFA timelines? How does it impact their possibilities for reunification? Can they have more visits? Can visits be modified? Can they, you know, like virtual visits, like can we do those more often? But they also have a lot of worry and fear of the unknown, right? Worry for not only their own health, but the health of their children. There was a study from around kinship carers, a group called the Grand Families Outcomes Work Group that did a study of 600 grand families around COVID. And they did talk about their sources of support being less adequate, and that they need where they get their most support is from family and friends. And what the help they need is like help to manage the children in school, childcare, some respite, and just time for self, which is really hard to find right now when you live in quarantine, for sure. Next slide. So we held a conference of 1,400 people, a virtual conference of 1,400 people last week. We had practitioners and researchers and policymakers from around the world, 20 countries. And it was our call to action to change child welfare. And so I just want to preface that some of these ideas might seem a little radical, but I want to bring them forth because we decided to do that conference because of an article that David Brooks wrote in The Atlantic monthly. So he wrote an article called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." And I'm also part of the Weave group that he is like a founder of or a supporter of. And in a session with David Brooks, he said, when looking back at other pandemics, as a society, we have an opportunity to do something great on the other end of this. And he said, it is our time to claim a redemptive narrative. And that resonated with me. I think it is time for a redemptive narrative in child welfare. The other speakers talked about, you know, the decreases in referrals and all those types of things. But what I want to ask us to think about is, what is the narrative that we're shaping, and how does that shape or frame an agency's response and public opinion? We have built a system that's based on kind of the exception rather than the rule, right? 10% or so, 10 to 20%, dependent upon state, where the cases are egregious: sexual abuse, physical abuse, major egregious harm. But 80% of the cases that come to child welfare are because of neglect. And so all the policies and procedures that this system is built on is built on that exception. And so we've created a surveillance system. And is surveillance really a service? It's a system that's saturated in risk. It's driven by procedures, and it delivers unequal outcomes and, unfortunately, inequities. I was really struck by some citizens who equated child protective services with stop and frisk policies in New York City. If that is how people are perceiving a service that they are receiving that is intended to be helpful, we have radical change ahead of us. And so some of what Michelle talked about around economic relief and support, we know the majority of families that are served by child welfare are poor, right? They have a multiplicity of needs: food, mental health, economic relief, housing stability. And I played a role in bringing differential response as a practice and policy and system transformation to many states in the country, actually with a University of Michigan alum, Karen Kaplan, who is no longer with us, but was my partner in crime doing the first national study on differential response. And just as a note, she also bequeathed a scholarship to the University of Michigan School of Social Work students around child neglect. And what is important about differential response is that it does set aside the substantiation decision, and it focuses on identifying and meeting family needs differently. So the last thing is last 2 points are just around belonging. We all want to belong. We want to belong to a group, to a family. Belonging is a fundamental human need, and children that come into the system oftentimes have no sense of belonging. And it hurts their health over the long term. And we know that social isolation is the silent killer, and it has such negative health outcomes for all of us. And so what we know works is that family having community, quality of relationships that children and parents have with workers, and even just a degree of hopefulness. So I think there's great opportunities for change. I'm completely stoked and motivated by some of the provocative thinkers that we had in our space last week, talking about changing the structures. Mandated reporting. Is it a policy without reason? A nod to a colleague, Gary Melton, who recently passed away, but has been really questioning this policy of mandated reporting and whether it actually encourages citizens to stay on the sidelines and expect a government response. I remember somebody saying, what if we, instead of mandated reporting, or mandated reporters, we had mandated supporters? And I think that's kind of an interesting concept. What about substantiation? Should that even be part of the child welfare system going forward? It really ends up sustaining an underclass, dependent upon your state. How long somebody stays on a registry impacts their ability for employment. And oftentimes families don't know how to even remove themselves from the registry. It's not the most transparent process. And for some families and some parents, the registry completely makes sense, but for many of the people that find themselves on the registry, it impacts their long-term impact, their long-term health and well-being. And then just the last kind of comment that I would leave you with is this notion that could we move away from the fundamental ideology of child safety to creating a family well-being system. Bertha Capon Reynolds, who was an American social worker, she was influential in kind of the creation of strengths-based practice and a radical social work and critical social work. She wrote, I'm going to leave you with a quote that she wrote in her 1951 book called Social Work and Social Living. And it goes as such. The real choice before us as social workers is whether we are to be passive or active. Shall we let the existing forms of social work, full of contradictions as they are, shape us to their mold? Shall we let customs, which may have prevailed in our agencies for so long that nobody thinks about them anymore, determine our practice? Shall we be content to give with one hand and withhold with the other, to build up and tear down at the same time the strength of a person's life? Or shall we become conscious of our own part in making a profession which will stand forthrightly for human well-being, including the right to be an active citizen? Thank you. And so my full question is thinking about child welfare, the virtual conduct of child welfare. Which do you think which effect do you think has occurred from child welfare being conducted virtually? Has it decreased workers' efficiency? Has it increased worker satisfaction and morale with their job? Has it decreased physical and emotional availability of staff to meet with families or decreased family participation?
Thanks, Lisa. And as people are responding to this last poll, I'll just thank you for a great presentation. Perfect bookend to a really interesting discussion and conversation. I'm going to hand this over now to my colleague, Shauna Lee, who is going to lead the question and answer period and then offer a few concluding remarks. So thank you, everybody.
I'll let Aaliyah pull up the poll results here in a second and get started with the question and answer period. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. That's one of the icons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can.
Yeah, so we do see an increased efficiency in work from workers' reports. Workers are saying they actually do have more emotional availability to meet with families, even though they have to put precautions in place with PPE and mask wearing and those types of things. And we've seen an increase in family participation in family meetings. So the one that is true is that workers seem more satisfied with their ability to work virtually. So.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we start off with a question that seems to address something of a common theme from Joyce Lee about the child welfare system from just a broader macro perspective. I think Todd can also speak to this question, but she mentions that Alan Detloff at the University of Houston has been really advocating for essentially abolishing or upending the child welfare system, given systemic racism against children of color. And Joyce wanted to know what the panelists think about this movement. I'm curious as well, so I'll go ahead and I guess maybe for efficiency, I'll just ask Lisa and then maybe Michelle and then Christina if they each want to respond in that order, potentially just to make it a little easier.
Okay. I'm very familiar with the upend movement and what they're trying to achieve. And I think what concerns people is like, how do you abolish something, right? It's kind of like the abolition movement around the police. And they're talking about putting different structures in place that that relate far more closely to the needs of the families that are served by child welfare right now. So economic supports and all the ancillary services like building a more robust family well-being system that includes childcare, economic assistance, and other types of services. So I think what they're trying to push us away from is a system that is what they would classify a family separation system. And I suppose the irony, or maybe not the irony, but there was such an uproar when children were being removed from their parents at the border about 2 years ago, right? And children were being put in cages, which is right even more horrific. And there was a pretty provocative article that a few people wrote, like, well, how different is that than what is happening in our child welfare system? A lot of those children were kind of moved through our child welfare agencies, private agencies, to find them, sometimes to find them places with kin, but also to almost like rehome them with foster and adoptive parents and in some cases people would say for profit. And so I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to delve deep into how do you disrupt a system that has caused a lot of harm. And what I appreciate is their attentiveness and willingness to listen to those who have been impacted, kids in care, parents, kin, resource parents, as well as adoptive parents.
Thanks. Michelle, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I would add to that I believe we are at a juncture. I think historically we've had enough time now to see how the current child protective service system, as it was created, now functions in society and what role it plays in society. And while I think there will always be a need for some type of response for that 20% that Lisa was referring to, for the severe cases, I periodically review child deaths. And I can tell you that those children needed to be someplace else. And we're often left with parents that, subsequently killed them. And so, we have those situations. I can't see a time in our future where, all children will be able to be kept in a safe family environment. I think as a system, we do our best to look for kinship arrangements when we can. But I think in every society, there's in any country you look at around the world, there's always a need for care for certain children in certain situations. That said, the other 80%, there's so much more we could be doing in terms of building out systems of prevention that may look something like differential response with perhaps a different kind of mechanism of getting that programming. There's an initiative that the Children's Bureau is leading right now to create more primary prevention opportunities and programs that reach families before they come into contact with the child welfare system. And I think that's where we can also begin to think about how do we begin addressing the systematic inequalities across our institutions. It's a much bigger effort that we need to engage in outside of the child welfare system. And we really need to think about how we direct resources. Right now, less than 4% of child welfare spending is spent on prevention. And there aren't resources for child maltreatment prevention coming from other places. I also think we need to think more broadly about violence prevention, because child maltreatment is just one form of violence that's usually situated in a signal for other forms of violence that might be happening in our communities, in our families. So how do we think bigger and broader about these issues? That's what I would add.
Thanks. Lots of great points. Christina, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I think this is, I like the idea of trying to sort of be more reimagining now, that this can be an opportunity to say, should we be maybe thinking about this differently? So that seems to really dovetail into this idea of how do we have a more proactive as opposed to a reactive system. I've been speculating for a couple of decades now about what do we need to do differently about this concept of mandated reporting, and surely there must be some more nuanced way of handling it than the way that it's currently framed. I realize that if people don't think they're required to do something, they may opt out, but surely there's enough minds out there that we can maybe take this pandemic as an opportunity to be more creative. So I think it's an interesting confluence. It would be intriguing to see if we could reimagine things in a more prevention focus. As Michelle just said, 4% is devoted towards prevention. That's kind of crazy on its face. If we would like to actually decrease the likelihood of child abuse and neglect, we'll probably need to reinvent the way that we're doing it now. I think it's going to take a lot of different energy to try to figure out how do you still protect that, the 20% that we're talking about, that there are folks who really do need some more vigilance, and then how do we provide better supports and again maybe track and identify even those 20% people preventatively, as opposed to, again, waiting for them to hit the system. So I'm always in the, can we go backwards? Can we get sooner before something actually occurs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are all great points. And I also want to mention that the second Fauri panel that's happening as a part of these sessions includes a presentation from Alan Detloff. And I bet he'll be talking about this very issue. And that link to register will be coming out, I believe tomorrow, Emma says. Oh, and she just posted the registration link in the chat. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more about his perspective on the child welfare system, I think that would be a wonderful opportunity to do so. And thank you for all the nuanced comments. I mean, it's a really complicated issue. You know, I would just throw out there, because I can't help myself, the work at that Brett Drake and his colleagues have been doing at the University of George Washington University. Sorry, of course I'm going to get it wrong. You know, underscores that the inequalities within the child welfare system seem to be manifestations of the systemic racism itself. And so if we don't abolish the racism, then, you know, are we really going to address the problem by getting rid of or really upending the child welfare system? So to me, that seems like a fundamental dilemma. I'd love to touch on the telework. There's a few questions here about, let's see here if I can pull them together. One is that someone pointed out that telework seems to have some advantages, but also staff also don't like it. It can be very alienating from colleagues. I am also curious how the balance between the telework situation, how you balance that out against the really very real need to see children in person. You know, as Christina's presentation pointed out, the tremendous declines in reporting right after, especially in the early days of the pandemic. So how have your participants in your panels and conferences kind of balanced those two needs, the potential increased satisfaction with certain aspects of work, as well as potentially the risk to kids when they're not being seen? Lisa, maybe you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so I mean, teleworking does not necessarily mean that people aren't visiting children, but telework just means that they're working from a remote location and not going into the office. I would agree with what Katie said, like telework does not work for all people. In fact, there was this interesting study that came out of kind of a marketing organization that looked across sectors, and people that are introverted really like telework, and people that are extroverted do not as much, right? And so there's like just our personalities of how we're formed and how we work really does impact whether we're going to resonate with this. And so what's important for supervisors is to really kind of understand each of their people's like kind of proclivity for how they work. With regard to seeing children, especially in the earliest days, workers, some child welfare agencies actually supplied PPE to their staff, and I think that was before we really knew as much as we know now, even though there are still some gaps in our knowledge around transmission of the virus. But at least now people are all wearing masks, and they will go out to people's homes and they ask questions like, is anybody sick in your home? Is anybody exhibiting any symptoms, right? So taking some precautions to at least try to manage their own and protect their own health. And then inviting people into an outdoor space, which works during the summer and spring and summer, and maybe even the fall months, depending upon where you live, less so probably in the winter, to be able to do visits with children outside the home. So at least to have those conversations, conduct whatever assessments in more of an open space to be able to protect their own health. Now, some people will say, but what about like the environment, right? The home environment? Then you're missing a kind of a piece of the puzzle, and that is, that is a real challenge. And so I think, agencies are handling that all very differently, but that's just a couple of ideas.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, we had a couple of questions. Well, first of all, it's 1:29. I'm aware of the time. And Emma has suggested we could maybe take one or two more questions. And if people have to jump off, that is, of course, totally fine. I believe 1:30 is the end point, but there were a couple more questions, so I might just throw them out there for the presenters today. I think another question came in about the moderating role of social support. I believe this pertains potentially to Christina's presentation, but just wondering about how whether her research looked at whether partners and other social support factors might lessen or mitigate some of the challenges that parents mothers in particular are facing during COVID-19?
So I can, it's obviously not something that I kind of directly addressed in this presentation, but we do actually track partner satisfaction in our study across time. And we actually observe some potential paradoxical effects is the best way that I could describe that, is that parents for whom they felt like they were very active copers were actually displacing a lot of their concerns on their children. And again, this is early in the pandemic when we were looking, perhaps if we had done the study now that the pandemic has been going on for what seems like ever, we might have different results. But at that time, what we observed is that parents, in general, their positive resources, I was kind of interested in whether or not their pre-existing positive resources, things like partner satisfaction, coping ability, even their overall social support system, whether or not those could represent buffers for them when they were confronted with the pandemic. And it appeared that people who judged themselves either to be good at that or have that as a resource were not availing themselves of that as much as they thought they might have, which was disappointing. So it's one of those kinds of effects where I would love to maybe see if that might change across time. I think actually Shauna has a little bit of work on partner dyadic coping that we've also looked at as well, about whether or not partners can use each other as a resource. And on one hand, yes, it helps at the beginning process, but it may not be sustained. And so that was some other longitudinal work that those kinds of positive benefits people get from them may not be as long lasting. It might help in sort of like a quick, immediate sense, in the acute sense, but may not be persistent.
How about one last question about reporting? There was a question about the sentinels in terms of people who are mandated reporters. I believe this came up in all of your presentations in one way or another, the role of mandated reporters, and then what happens in a pandemic when those mandated reporters are no longer in contact with children. So one question specifically was about where the biggest drop in reporting was in terms of teachers, hospitals. And so I was curious if anyone wanted to touch on that. I'm also wondering if the reporting is starting to go up. I actually haven't seen the more recent data. I've only seen the last, sort of the first 3 months and maybe into the summer. But I'm curious if now that school is sort of virtually reopened, what we might be seeing. So if you all would like to speak to that, and maybe, I'm not sure who best to start with, but Michelle, do you feel comfortable jumping in on that question? And then we'll go from there to Christina and then Lisa, and then we'll wrap up.
I can at least speak to data for Ohio. Probably like most states, schools are reopening at different rates depending on where you are and where COVID cases are at in your particular county. But what we saw was a pretty drastic decline in the spring for almost all counties. It was around a 50% drop in reports, but now in some of the counties that we're working closely with, they are seeing those reports resuming again. So I do think that at least for the data I've seen for Ohio, I think a number of those reports were from educators, from teachers in schools.
I would have to agree that that's going to be where you're going to probably have seen the largest drop. There are other obvious sources that were also decreased. Those who were, for example, doctor reporters or mental health reporters were also down. But I think that the educational impact, what's going to be intriguing is that there's a number of children who are not going back to school and are doing Zoom school. So to that extent, like, how are we going to be able to parse some of that? It's gonna take a while for us to really disentangle what's been happening with reporting. And again, because we're so reliant on this sort of this kind of archaic mandated reporting system, we haven't really generated a more creative model for how people can do that and still track students who might still be, for example, doing Zoom school, or are now being. I know some families, at least in my classes, even where their kids are now just being homeschooled rather than being sent to school at all. So.
And so similar to what Michelle and Christina said, in Colorado, thanks to the good work of my colleague Mark Winokur at the Social Work Research Center at Colorado State, we know that we've had a 40% drop in referrals between last year and this year, right? But that hasn't necessarily borne out to be the case for all people of color. Actually, we've seen an increase in the number of referrals for American Indian families and Alaska Native families in Colorado. And of that drop, we've had a 74% decrease in the educational referrals coming in. So that's pretty significant. But I think it's also important to make note of, at least in Colorado, and I don't know if the data bear out across all states, is that educational referrals also have the highest screen out rate. So teachers report at a really high rate, but they also get screened out by child welfare agencies at the highest rate, at least here in Colorado.
Okay.
Ohio too.
Didn't mean to interrupt you, Michelle. Yeah, lots of big questions remaining that will be, as Christina said, disentangling for years to come, and hopefully coming up with better solutions. I think we can all agree on that moving forward. But I would like to thank the panelists so much for participating today. Really a wonderful presentation. And hopefully you can join us for the second part of the Fauri lecture that Emma mentioned. Emma, if you leave the chat open for a few minutes, I will respond to a couple more questions in the chat and the Q&A box, some specific questions people had. But other than that, I think we're wrapping up for this afternoon. Thank you again for attending, and best wishes for those of you who are Zoom schooling and Zoom teaching. Take care.